Welcome to the Heritage is Living podcast, a place to explore and challenge what heritage is and how it fits into our world today. Through this podcast, we'll speak with experts in the heritage field and beyond to understand how heritage can help us to live aware, with care, and with purpose. This podcast is recorded in Ottawa on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Trust works on the lands and territories of many Indigenous peoples across what is now known as Canada. I'm your host, Patricia Kell, Executive Director of the National Trust for Canada. On this episode, we are discussing how heritage conservation intersects with reconciliation with Kisha Supernant. Dr. Kisha Supernant is Métis and an Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Alberta. She's the Director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology. An award-winning teacher, researcher, and writer, her research explores Indigenous histories, cultural identities, landscapes, remote sensing, spatial analysis, Métis archaeology, and heart-centered archaeological practice. Her research with Indigenous communities in Western Canada explores how archaeologists and communities can build collaborative research relationships and work together to support Indigenous cultural heritage values. Recently, she's been engaged in using remote sensing technologies to locate and protect unmarked burials at the request of First Nations communities in Alberta and Saskatchewan. She is published in local and international journals on GIS and archaeology, collaborative archaeological practice, Métis archaeology, and Indigenous archaeology in the post-TRC era. Dr. Supernant is currently the president of the Indigenous Heritage Circle. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm talking to you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and I'm always conscious of the many traditional territories in which the National Trust works, and grateful to the Indigenous peoples for their stewardship of those lands since time immemorial.
Yes, and I'm joining today from Miskutiwaskaigan, which is the Cree name for Edmonton, Alberta. I'm in Treaty 6 territory, as well as the homeland of the Métis.
So I'd like to begin today by talking a little bit about you. So how did you get involved in archaeology?
I first became interested in archaeology when I was a teenager. Like many in our field, the lure of an adventurous sense of exploration and understanding, the kind of Indiana Jones effect, as it were, was something that really intrigued me. I got interested through my father in part, who was reading a lot about ancient civilizations and how we understand things from the ancient past. And he got me reading some of those texts. From that, I thought it sounded like a really interesting career. You know, it was at the time of my life where I was trying to understand, okay, what does it mean to start to grow up and to start to think about what I want to do for my life. And this just sounded very intriguing, very exciting, an opportunity to travel a lot, to sort of see a lot of the world, and to try to uncover the unknown. And so I actually went to university with the intention of doing archaeology, but I always thought of archaeology, as many do, as something that happens elsewhere, not in my own backyard. So my intention had been to study ancient civilizations in, the Middle East, not to do work with Indigenous communities in Canada.
So, but you moved into that zone, and you identify as Métis, as an Indigenous person, and yet you practice the Western science of archaeology. So how did you come to bring those two things together?
I am Métis, and I grew up knowing very little about what that meant. That's not that uncommon in my generation. Many of us were disconnected from our families for a variety of reasons. In my case, it was my father's being raised in foster care. When I went to university, I had an interest in archaeology, and then I was also starting to seek to understand more about what it meant to be a Métis person, an Indigenous person. Those things happened to come together for me, in part because I had the opportunity to take an archaeological field school. It's quite common in archaeological training to take a field school because much of our work is ground-based and requires a kind of practical understanding of the techniques of archaeology. My field school was done in partnership with the Scowlitz First Nation, and this would have been over 20 years ago now, and it was unusual at the time to have a truly collaborative type of field experience, but I was privileged to have that. This meant we worked with community members every single day. They were on site with us. They helped do the excavation work that we did. We also followed cultural protocols as established by the community. So this included wearing of ochre paste, for example, on certain parts of our bodies to make us recognizable to the ancestors on the site. This was just woven into my field training. So alongside learning the Western science of archaeology, how to lay out units, how to dig in the earth, how to make sense of the materials we were finding from that lens, we were also integrating already that sense of connection with an Indigenous past and an Indigenous present by having those community partners involved. That was a really meaningful experience for me, in part because the two community members who were with us kind of every day really took me under their wing. They recognized me as sort of a young Indigenous woman trying to figure out my way through this, and really supported me and mentored me, and looked after me while I spent it ended up being 9 weeks in the field with them. And that set me on quite a different path. It took me a couple of years for that teaching to land, as teachings often do take time. And it really set me on a different course where I realized archaeology was very important for those living community members, that they felt a deep and enduring connection to the landscapes of their ancestors. And they also had both an interest in the Western archaeological science that we were doing, but also there were moments of discomfort in that, where they were trying to find the balance between what it meant to be Indigenous and to do archaeology. And those are two aspects of myself that I have long tried to seek to find a path where those can both kind of coexist at the same time, because often that Western scientific lens can sometimes work against or work in a different way than an Indigenous approach to an understanding of that same material past. So all of that to say, that moment of the field school that I was involved in was really set my path, which now I walk, which is doing that kind of community engaged, community led scholarship, bringing both the strengths of Western science, but also Indigenous ways of knowing and being into making sense of the past in the present and for the future.
So we're going to come back and talk about that community engaged practice again a bit in a minute, but just by way of sort of setting the stage here, I wanted to say at the beginning that you are also the president of the Indigenous Heritage Circle, and could you tell us a little bit about what the Indigenous Heritage Circle is and what its mission is?
So the Indigenous Heritage Circle is an Indigenous founded and Indigenous led national heritage organization. So it was founded formally in 2016 by Karen Aird, who's Saulteaux, she's First Nations, by Madeline Redfern, who's Inuk, and by Yvonne Boyer, who is a senator and also Métis, and Julie Harris, who is a settler of settler descent. The vision for the Indigenous Heritage Circle is to have a national voice for a broad understanding of Indigenous heritage. The definition that we have on our website, for example, is very comprehensive. It's this idea that heritage is more than the material things of the past or the landscapes of our ancestors. It is a living, breathing part of who we are. It includes language and song and tradition and knowledge and dance and all the materials as well. And it's an essential part of what makes us Indigenous and how we understand ourselves. So the mission of the Indigenous Heritage Circle is to advocate for an understanding of Indigenous heritage at the national level, to support Indigenous communities in their own goals around their own heritage, and really to affirm and uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples to that cultural heritage as part of our vibrant present and building a bright future. So we have a board of very engaged Indigenous folks from across the country. Almost all of our board right now is Indigenous, and they work across the heritage sector broadly. So we have folks who help run museums or are building cultural centers. We have folks who work on language revitalization, on repatriation, and then folks like me, I'm a practicing archaeologist, because we recognize that diversity of Indigenous heritage. And we're very excited to have worked for many years now alongside other national organizations such as the National Trust, Parks Canada, on various kinds of projects to enhance and bring forward a deeper understanding of the importance of Indigenous heritage in the lands that we call Canada today.
Great, thanks. I think that's important context, and both that sense of heritage as a living entity, and then also the work of the circle as a force to bring Indigenous heritage interests from across the country together into a single voice. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to turn now and talk a little bit about your work. So you've made international headlines for your work with ground-penetrating radar in searching for unmarked graves on the grounds of former residential schools across Canada. So first, can you explain what ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, is?
Yes, I'd be happy to provide a little bit of context about ground-penetrating radar. At its very simplest way to define it, ground-penetrating radar takes an electromagnetic wave, not similar to something like radar or sonar, same principle, and sends it into the ground from an antenna. So that antenna sends a wave into the ground. That wave travels through the earth, and as it encounters different types of things below the surface, it reflects that wave back to the antenna. So for example, you put an antenna on the ground and you're pushing it along, and there's a buried rock as one possible thing that you might find. The wave will travel down, bounce off that rock, and reflect back to the antenna. The area around that doesn't have a rock will look different. It won't have the same kind of reflection. When we are using ground-penetrating radar to detect areas that may have graves, we are looking for change in the soil. So we're looking for the grave shaft, where a pit has been dug that is about the right depth, the right size, the right shape, that it could be a grave, but it can't X-ray the ground. A ground-penetrating radar doesn't necessarily detect the presence of human remains. It just detects a shape that looks like it could be a grave. So there's a lot of interpretation in the use of ground-penetrating radar in this realm of the locating of unmarked graves. And we really look for patterning, we look for traits, and we look for organization. So if you have a series of pits in the ground in, say, a line that are about the right shape, size, depth, then we can start to say, okay, this looks like it could be a collection of graves. So we're really trying to understand changes in the subsurface, in the soil itself.
So the results of that work at former residential schools, I think, really shocked the nation back when these results started being made public. Can you talk about how the kind of impact that the work has had in Indigenous communities?
Yes, when Tk'emlúps te Secwépemc made their announcement in 2021, it really did resonate in a different way across Canada, across the world, than we had previously seen before. I always think it's important to understand that this was not new in terms of knowing that children had died at residential schools. Even when the schools were open, there was a lot of sort of whistleblowing saying, hey, this is a real problem. There's a lot of children dying in these schools. And then, of course, the work of survivors over many years, leading to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also brought to light the fact that thousands of children had died in the schools. And this includes records that the schools themselves kept, that the government kept, that the Indian agents kept. This was already something that was known in certain circles. I think what happened in 2021 was a couple of things. One was the number at a particular school. So the number 215 was first announced. Now, I want to be clear. This is not actually 215 children that died at the residential school. That's actually not information that's known yet. It was ground penetrating radar results that were presented. It's just that initial media coverage, some things were not as clear as they maybe could and should have been. That being said, I think that number really did resonate, and it kind of hit a particular note for many people in that post-TRC era where more people were becoming aware of the impacts of residential school. Your sort of everyday non-Indigenous Canadian had more knowledge about what was going on, but not to the level of the recognition of how many children had been lost through this very horrific, 150-year history. And this is something that since 2021, we've seen a much greater emphasis on finding the missing children, although I'm also starting to hear language shifting toward the disappeared children, because that's an important distinction, because there's more information coming to light about the fact that schools were built with cemeteries, planned. They knew children were likely to die, and there was not necessarily an intention to always send them home to their communities. So that's very important. And the other thing that's really become very clear is that many families were never notified or given information about where their child had died, or where they were buried. And they still don't know, in many cases, how many children, from which families, where their places of burial may be. So the searches underway right now are to try to find those locations, trying to bring a sense of this is where the children could be buried. Many of them were probably buried in cemeteries. Some of those cemeteries were community cemeteries, so there would have been other members of the surrounding area who were buried there. So the search is actually itself very complex, but many nations are now prioritizing searching for the graves of these children and seeking some sense of justice and accountability for the thousands of children who never came home, and for the families who have been living with that pain and that trauma now for for generations. So that's really the shift that we've seen since 2021, is just a vast increase in the number of nations leading searches to try to find answers about the missing children.
Yes, and I have to say that as a mother, I find that notion of having your child, I mean, not just taken away from you, but then not coming back and having no certainty about what happened to that child, that would be just a devastating life experience. So when you talk about doing this work, you talk about, and you alluded to it at the beginning, but the work that needs to be done with community, hand in hand with community. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, about why it's important to proceed in that way.
Yes. One interesting development since the announcement in 2021 is the ways in which community have started to reach out to archaeologists, for example, like myself and others who have similar sorts of expertise. We, as a discipline, archaeology has not always been a great partner to Indigenous communities, has often been very extractive, but there has been, since I started in the field with that field work, that kind of experience I described at the beginning has actually become quite a bit more common. We tend to work alongside community a lot more now. In the work to find missing children, this is essential. I only work with community to help however I can when they come and ask, because this is not research in the same way that my other work might be research. This really is, for me, a form of service. I have a skill set. I have knowledge about what these technologies can and cannot do. And communities can come to me and I can try to provide what knowledge I have to meet the needs that they have around finding the children. And this must be done in a community-led way, and really in a survivor-led way, because the survivors are often the ones who are sharing their knowledge about the children, about what they know, what they've heard, what they've seen and experienced. And that often guides where we look with the technology that we're applying right now. The other reason, of course, has to be hand in hand with community and really led by community is because of the emotional and spiritual weight of the work. And, you alluded to this a little bit in your response. This is very heavy. And, as a parent as well, just the concept of the children being forcibly taken to not be seen most of the time, and then to not come home really resonates and is really difficult to bear when you hear survivors sharing about their siblings who they lost, or the child who disappeared and never came back and they never knew what happened to them. That really can evoke all kinds of emotions for everyone who's involved. And then because we're dealing with ancestors and relatives who have passed on, there's all of the spiritual weight of it as well. Now, depending on where you are and with whom you're working, communities will have different ceremonies for how to take up this work and how to honor and commemorate those spirits of those children. But every community has something, and going in a way that's respectful of and centering of ceremony is really essential for everyone's health and well-being in the process. And so only the community is in a position to determine what those ceremonies are, who needs to be included, the kind of protocols that need to be followed when you're even using the technology. So the sort of spiritual and emotional impacts of this make it essential that this work is community-led.
So I think you're talking about a really interesting juxtaposition or interweaving even of like the Western scientific practice and the traditional Indigenous practices around doing these activities. And I think it's remarkable that you've found a path that accommodates both of those.
Yes, there's a real movement, I would say, in science more broadly, perhaps, to understand the strengths of different ways of knowing and the way that they can be brought together. And the work that I'm doing right now with residential schools to support community is one example of this, where, yes, we're using Western science, and it's really also important that we use the best possible science we can to be able to provide the most clarity to communities of what the science can actually accomplish and what it can't. One of the outcomes of the announcement from Kamloops is people thinking that ground penetrating radar can actually find human bones, which it can't. So, we have to do really, really good science, but we also have to understand how that science does interweave with or support or engage with Indigenous ways of knowing, which also have their own strengths, including what some have articulated as Indigenous science, right? That Indigenous knowledge systems also have observation and assessment sort of built into them. That being said, I think in the moment that we're in, there's a need to deploy some of these Western scientific methods because Indigenous knowledge has not been recognized as valid. Survivors have long shared experiences and testimonies around missing children and even their own trauma and abuse that have not always been believed. And because it's like, oh, they're just telling a story. How do we know it's true? And right now, what many communities are seeing is that sometimes the Western scientific evidence that can be gathered through the methods is easier for some people to accept as truth. Now, is it more or less true? I think that's really important to say it's not. I mean, survivors are telling the truth. But the truths that the ground penetrating radar and the other kinds of technologies we're using now produce are easier for some people to recognize as truth. And therefore, we're trying to bring the strengths of Western science to bear on something that needs that weight, whether it be in a legal context, whether it just be in the sort of public sphere. Sometimes people believe those sort of what they consider hard evidence in a different way than they do the testimony of survivors and communities.
So You've co-edited a book called Archaeologies of the Heart, where you talk about bringing heart-centered practice into archaeology. So what is that, and how can the heritage sector learn from this?
So Archaeologies of the Heart, which was really a joint labor of love, as I like to say, between myself and three other amazing scholars, Jane Baxter, Natasha Lyons, and Sonia Atelier. The purpose behind this book was to invite a reorientation, I guess, of our practice as archaeologists. For, even with all the engaged work that I did working alongside community, archaeology still trains us to primarily work from the head. So it's a very intellectual exercise, right? Where we're analyzing and we're gathering data and we're doing statistics and we're testing of hypotheses. And it remains very much grounded in the mind and the intellect. And our invitation with the book was to imagine an archaeology led by heart as much as by head. This idea that we are all whole people, that we are not just brains that operate in the world. We are not just these like objective, beings that move through the world without being impacted and engaged with the world in all the senses that we may have. And it's an opportunity to recognize the strengths of all of our experiences as humans, both in terms of how we work with each other. So this idea that we can, have an ethic of care, caring for each other, caring for the work that we do, that we can build strong, healthy relationships with each other as practitioners. And this is partly in response to the fact that archaeology has not been the most safe of disciplines especially for diverse people and marginalized people. They've often found it to be quite a violent place in sort of many different understandings of the word violence. And so heart-centered practice is to say we need to build strong and healthy relationships and respect boundaries in that practice, that we can also make space for our emotional connection to each other, but also to the past, and recognizing that as humans, we have emotions, and those emotions often impact the decisions that we make. In archaeology, we haven't really explored the ways in which emotion can impact decision-making for past peoples. It's often been very biological, or about like power and status, but not about emotion necessarily. And so we're asking and inviting people to explore what that might mean, but then also to approach that broad understanding and engagement with the past and the present that still maintains a sense of rigor. And we push back against the idea that there's really only rigor in Western systems of knowledge, that sort of scientific rigor, quote unquote. And we say that, every knowledge system has rigor. And caring for the work that we do actually improves our rigor. It doesn't necessarily introduce bias, and we should be seeking to be objective. Objectivity is something that has been critiqued quite extensively in philosophy of science and kind of throughout the last few decades of not actually being the reality of what it means to be human in the world. And so instead of trying to reduce our bias, we have to be very explicit about it. We have to recognize where our positions are in the work that we do, but also the fact that when we care about our work, we tend to do it better. Like, I do better science because I'm deeply connected to the work that I do. And I am not going to overstate my results when I'm doing a ground penetrating radar survey for community. I have to be true to that science, because to overstate it or to do it in a way that introduces incorrect information would actually do harm. So we really focus on this idea that caring about what we do and bringing that ethic of care actually improves the work. So the book is an exploration of all of these things throughout archaeology as a discipline, but it really is an approach that expands well beyond archaeology, in that we can take a heart-centered approach to many different disciplines, many different fields. It's really just about an orientation, right? This idea that we come from our hearts and not just from our heads, and that we recognize that as a strength, not as a weakness, as many of us have been taught, that emotions are somehow to be ignored, or that our heart is somehow to be separate from our head.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very interesting in the context of the heritage community, where many people work in this field because they feel a passionate connection to the subject matters, and so are in fact very heart-centered, attached to what they're doing. I'd like to turn now and to talk for a minute about what needs to change in order for Indigenous heritage to take up a more central place in the practice of heritage conservation in Canada. So, and maybe we can begin by talking about UNDRIP, so the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which Canada has adopted. And it states that Indigenous peoples have a right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage. Is that happening now? And if not, what's missing?
So the short answer is no, that is not happening right now, at least not in a broad sense. There are many First Nations, Métis, Inuit, who are actively engaging with their heritage in many, many ways, but the rights to our heritage are not necessarily being recognized and upheld, both in terms of practice and in Canadian law. And this is really important because if Canada is serious about implementing UNDRIP, then the heritage sector broadly will have to reorient and have to transform to an extent. My experience as an Indigenous heritage practitioner in many ways within the heritage conservation field is that I haven't often seen how I fit. And that is partly a legacy of how the heritage conservation movement has been shaped and formed over the past 50 years and beyond in Canada. And its sort of focus on more recent history and on often built heritage, right? The emphasis on, preserving and maintaining and uplifting built heritage in a variety of ways. I've seen change certainly over the past, especially over the past 5 years, I would say, that has really started to understand that heritage expands much beyond that built heritage and much beyond settler colonial heritage in Canada. So it's not just the places of people who came here, but in fact, there is a much deeper and longer history and heritage that extends back thousands upon thousands of years that is also very important and very alive in Canada today. Most of my experience has been in that deeper heritage, right? In the archaeological, what's considered the archaeological realm of heritage. So things that are, in the ground that might date, up to 14 or 15,000 years ago in the lands we call Canada. And in that realm, Indigenous people's rights to our own heritage has definitely not been recognized. Heritage resources, as they're called across many of the provinces and territories, are managed at those levels, but they're managed in a way that kind of gives primacy to the Crown, in this case, the provincial Crown, to maintain, manage, and care for and steward all of those material belongings of Indigenous ancestors. This is actually a barrier to Indigenous rights because we don't currently have the right to make decisions about what happens to the belongings of our own ancestors. So they end up being, excavated out of the earth, put into repositories, and not under our control. And we don't have an ability to make a decision about that. So that's one kind of concrete example, but there's many aspects to Indigenous heritage that go beyond that material record, where we still need to figure out how Canadian law and also how practice needs to change to uphold our rights and to recognize that Indigenous heritage matters, not just to us as Indigenous people, but to the broader nation that is now known as Canada. Like, this is part of every heritage place that people in the sector are passionate about. It sits on Indigenous land and has Indigenous history. And there's a way that the heritage conservation field needs to expand its understanding of the significance of place that recognizes that it's not just the building, it's not just the prominent person who built that house. There's a history much beyond that. And there's much more that the sector can do to integrate those diverse narratives and those deeper narratives into the work and into the way that we communicate with the public about heritage in this country.
Oh, so let's dig in on that a little bit. So you're saying that there's much more that could be done. What are those things? What are the questions that the folks who manage heritage sites should be asking themselves, or the partnerships they're seeking to undertake, or the changes in their programming that they should be contemplating? Or maybe there are other things that are even more important.
I think that for those who manage heritage places and the kind of day-to-day work of the heritage sector, the first thing I would say is wherever you are, there is an Indigenous history. If you're in Canada, there is a connection to that deeper history. And I think what I would like to see is an invitation to explore what that might be. Now, this doesn't mean going and, reading Wikipedia about that area. What it ultimately means is thinking about building relations, right? So at the heart of so much of the work of Indigenous heritage is relationality, is a sense of being a good relation, both with each other as humans, but also with the land and with the water and with the plants and animals. And I'm not saying that every heritage practitioner needs to take that approach, but I do think there's value in thinking about the relationships that could be built with either local First Nations or Métis or Inuit communities, or heritage organizations that center Indigenous heritage in the region, to be able to explore what the responsibilities are of that heritage place to help to bring attention to that deeper history. Because I think there's a danger in sort of saying, hey, we can just add a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements are important, but they are not the end goal. They don't complete the work that needs to be done, for example. So while heritage places should have a land acknowledgement, if you have that without thinking about what that actually means and how the story and the narratives need to be shifted in response to that, then the work is not complete yet. So thinking about how to build relations, how to pay greater attention to that deeper history, and to think also about what you're commemorating. There are certainly locations in this country that are heritage places that are commemorating people, moments, activities that were quite harmful to Indigenous people and sometimes to other marginalized people. So also broadening the narratives, even about that kind of settler history that's told, and thinking about, well, what did that actually mean when that person or this place was built? What was it built for? And who is it built to keep out? And that can be a really important way to kind of, I would say, enrich the narratives that we tell, kind of bring a different and more complete and complex understanding of the people that might be recognized or commemorated, or the actions that might be commemorated at any given location. So in terms of, there's that deeper history, but then also the impact of whoever or wherever or whatever that place is recognizing. And those two aspects, I think, can be very powerful because so many heritage places reach the public and they become part of that storytelling of Canada's heritage. And there's a responsibility, I would say, that comes alongside that, to not just tell a neat, happy narrative of that, we all get along, we've always all gotten along. That's not the reality. When we talk about truth and reconciliation, we can't forget about the truth part. Truth first. And so telling those truths at heritage places is a really important step on a journey toward reconciliation.
So what do you see as the barriers, to the what you've just described happening, but also for a more complete sort of implementation of the ambitions that are defined in the UN Declaration?
I think there's certainly challenges in many different vectors. Probably the most significant that the entire sector faces, whether it be from an Indigenous perspective or just from a heritage conservation perspective, is resources. I know there's an increased willingness to explore what this might mean, but finding ways to reinterpret or to add new parts to programming, for example, it takes money, it takes people, it takes expertise, and that remains in short and sometimes seemingly dwindling supply within the sector. So I think that as a whole, continuing to advocate for greater investment is really, really important and would enable much more of these types of activities to take place. That being said, I think that there is an opportunity to imagine the reallocation or prioritization of things with existing resources that can start the process. But I do recognize that in many cases, it's really a resource issue, right? Not a lack of interest. It's just like, don't have anyone to help lead the way. So that's one. I think there is also challenge in the broader heritage landscape that is faced by other kinds of pressures, right? So the majority of Indigenous material heritage, so we're talking now about the ancestors' belongings, is impacted through development and the pressure to expand and build new roads and new pipelines and new housing. All of that can impact heritage. So there's a lot of pressures that can come and challenges that can come from trying to do ethical heritage work when the pressures are great from other sectors, and that can be a real challenge. And then there's the legal landscape, right? So there's a lot of different laws, both federally and provincially, that impact different parts of heritage. So getting a sense of alignment around how that change needs to happen remains, I think, a pretty daunting challenge because so many different aspects of Canadian law would need to shift to be able to implement UNDRIP, even just on the heritage side of things, let alone the other many other rights that are articulated in the Declaration itself. So I do see that there is need for greater aligned advocacy around both more resourcing for the heritage sector, how we navigate through those developmental pressures, and how do we meaningfully change law and related policy to uphold and recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples.
So I'd like to sort of move into the final phase of our conversation and talk about why making the link between Indigenous heritage and the broader heritage community is important. So do you think, can heritage conservation and the heritage field more broadly contribute to decolonization and reconciliation?
I do think there's real potential for the heritage sector more broadly to make meaningful contributions to decolonization and reconciliation. I think we need to start, though, again, with that truth telling and recognizing why there aren't that many Indigenous people in the heritage sector and why Indigenous heritage is not often considered as part of it. I've tried to make this point in a number of places, but Indigenous people feel as connected to their heritage as many of the passionate people in the heritage sector feel about the places and the landscapes and the stories that they tell. We too feel very connected to our heritage. The difference is that we have been actively removed from that connection over generations, right? So there has been disconnection through residential schools, through the 60s scoop, through the kind of child welfare system today, through the prison system, through this ongoing attempt to take away our indigeneity for many, many generations. And for us, this moment that we're in right now is one where we're seeing reclamation, we are seeing reconnection, we are seeing resurgence, and our heritage as Indigenous people is at the center of that, whether it be language, whether it be art, whether it be traditional knowledge, whether it be the places of our ancestors. Heritage is interwoven in our attempt to build a brighter future for our nations, for ourselves, for our children. And I think that this is something that folks in the heritage sector understand inherently that heritage is important. And it's not important because of the past. It's important because of the present, and it's important because of the future. So whether you're in the sector because you care about the role of historic buildings in combating climate change, or whether you're there because you recognize that we need to be able to tell the stories of the past in order to understand where we're going, we can align because Indigenous peoples also understand the power of the past, the power of place, and the power of heritage in building those futures. So for me, it's a matter of us finding those places where we have a lot of common ground, but also recognizing that Indigenous peoples, we haven't been able to care for our heritage in our own way, and that we need to be supported in order to decide what that looks like, and then to enact those practices on our own heritage with support and alignment from, the heritage sector and the broader public. So there's a lot of common ground, but we also need to recognize that history of inequality and how we can work together to continue to have a vibrant heritage sector, but also to uphold and recognize how Indigenous heritage is an essential part of healing, of reconciliation, and of moving forward as this nation that we call Canada today.
So I hear real strength and passion in your words there. And so my final question, are there particular elements of traditional Indigenous cultural practices that you think should inform all of heritage conservation, not just for the Indigenous community?
I think that's a very big question, and I do not necessarily feel that I am a person who can fully answer it. I would say in principle, yes, there are many aspects to that that would probably support many aspects of heritage. I think especially in terms of how we care for and look after place. We're seeing a lot right now developing around how we grapple with the climate crisis, and a lot of turning to long-standing Indigenous knowledge where we've been grappling with climate crises for tens of thousands of years around the world, and some of the knowledge stretches back that far. So I think there's a lot to be learned from Indigenous knowledge in how we build those sort of possible futures. But I think it also needs to be attentive to the fact that Indigenous knowledge is varied, and there's no kind of umbrella or in Indigenous knowledge, right? It's Indigenous knowledges. So for me, when we're thinking about this in Canada, it has to be grounded in place. So what happens in particular locations needs to be attentive to the knowledge systems of that place, So you can't take a Cree approach to traditional knowledge and apply it in Nova Scotia and Mi'kmaq territory, right? So there's different kinds of ways in which we need to recognize how Indigenous knowledge can inform. So I'm wary to sort of say a blanket, this is how or what, but I think it is essential and it's important. And if there is one takeaway, it's that building of relations, building good relations. That is something that we see resonating across many different Indigenous knowledges, in perhaps articulated in slightly different ways, but definitely a common purpose, which is we need to be good relations to each other. We need to be good relations to the land. And we need to think about that in terms of building a better future for all of our relations.
Heritage is Living is produced in English and in French and is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow us on your favorite podcast platform to never miss an episode as we explore how heritage conservation is more than you think.